We have now the second speaker of the session. We are now in session 3. Go ahead.
Thank you. My name is, well, I suppose I ought to put it up here. That's me. And I am at the Center for Theology and Religious Studies at Lund University down south. And I was actually very surprised to be called here. This is certainly the first lecture I've ever given to a group of physicists, which of course does make the assignment a bit tricky for me, but we'll see what we can do. In my, so to speak, civilian life, when I'm not off lecturing to physicists, I am a Old Testament scholar, and generally what Germans call an Altorientalist, studying various ancient languages from the ancient Near East, specifically Hebrew, classical Hebrew that is, not so much modern Hebrew, which I'm not that good at all, and Ugaritic, which we will look a bit at today. To the left here, I've written something down, and I noticed that we have at least one Hebrew speaker here who can read, or two at least.
At least 3.
At least 3, wonderful. Those of you who know Hebrew will notice that I've used the square script and not the cursive one, because I am a classical Hebraist and been taught in the Masoretic text tradition. But what it says is "Ein kol hadash tachat hashamish." There is nothing new beneath the sun. There's nothing new under the sun, which is of course a very famous quotation from the book of Kohelet, Ecclesiastes, and Predikaren, for those of you who know it in Swedish. Which is actually not really what I'm here to talk about. It's just to set the tone. You know, this famous adage that there's nothing new beneath the sun. And I called this lecture Nothing New Beneath the Burning Sun. The burning sun. Not just any old sun, you know. In any culture you can find all these references to, you know, living under the sun. You can find it all over the ancient Near East, meaning the world, life under the sun. Tachat hashamish, under the sun. But there are, or rather were, in the biblical world and the culture surrounding it, a number of more specific references to the sun that are connected to burning, to heat, to drought, to death, and even to fever in some contexts, which is what I will be talking about today. So, nothing new under the burning sun, climate and verbs in Northwest Semitic. Not climate change, as you put it. It's actually not about climate change. That's not my field at all. But it is, in some sense, about climate. The other thing I put up here is not Hebrew at all, but a rather closely related language to Hebrew, called Ugaritic, which was, as the name implied, spoken in Ugarit.
It's Turkey.
No, it's not in Turkey. Who among you knows where Ugarit is?
In Syria.
Yes, it's in Syria. Or rather was, because it was destroyed about 1180, 1170 BC, something like that. It's in Syria, the coast of modern Syria, near the modern-day town called Latakia. About 12 kilometers from Latakia. And Ugarit was a sprawling megalopolis, speaking in Bronze Age terms, of course, but it really was a large city with many languages spoken there, many cultures cross-secting, intersecting. It was a great commerce center between the Hittite kingdom in the north, in what is today Turkey, Egypt in the south, and Mesopotamia, of course, which was, you know, Babylonia, Assyria, two of the greatest powers in the ancient Near East. And, well, you know, here you have the Mediterranean. This is the Mediterranean. Here you have Ugarit. It's absolutely at the center of everything. Here you have the Holy Land, so to speak, Palestine, Israel. Here you have Egypt, here you have Mesopotamia, here you have the Hittites. So Ugarit is actually at the center of everything, which made it a very important city.
How big? You said large.
Oh, big. In terms of population, oh, I've seen. I do not want to pull that out of my hat without being sure. I've seen There have been attempts to calculate that, but I'm not sure exactly. I won't go there because I'll say something that's wrong. And at Ugarit, many languages were spoken. At least 8 languages are attested there in writing. But the language which was at home at Ugarit was, of course, what we call Ugaritic. And this is Ugaritic, transcribed into some sort of Latin characters. It was originally written in alphabetic cuneiform. But that's a bit hard to read. What it says was probably something like Nuratu ilima shapshu sahrirat la ashamuma biyadi bunni illi moti. Something like that, give or take. You know, they didn't write the vowels down, so you have to reconstruct those. And it means Nuratu ilima, the lamp of the gods. And who is the lamp of the gods? The lamp of the gods is Shapshu, the sun. Hebrew Shemesh, which you had to the left. Arabic Shams, Akkadian Shamshu, or Shamash, the Akkadian god of the sun. So we have the lamp of the gods, that is Shapshu, the solar goddess Shapshu. And what is she doing? She is Sahrirat, or something like that.
Released?
Excuse me?
The Shahrur released? What is that?
No, not that. I know what you're referring to. No, this is with a tzadeh, Sahrirat. So it's actually distantly related to the word Sahur.
White.
It's a word for a color.
White.
Yeah. Probably white or something like that in classical Hebrew. It's not exactly clear, but here it apparently means something like the sun is burning, she is glowing, she is...
Like white hot.
Yeah, white hot, white or red hot. Something like that, yeah.
White hot is more hot than red hot.
Well, she's very hot, anyway. We'll get into exactly what this word means later on. It's highly unclear exactly what this Sahrirat means, but we'll get into that. And here we have the parallel line, La ashamuma biyadibuni illi moti. The shamuma is the shamayim, of course, heavens. For those of you who know Hebrew, the heavens are probably powerless, or something like that. And why are they powerless? They are powerless because they are biyadi, biyad, in the hand of whom? In the hand of Mort, Mawet, death. The son of the divine son, death. And that's quite a sentence to start with, isn't it? The divine lamp, the sun, burns. The heavens are powerless in the hands of the divine son. Son with an O, that is. Death. Well, you know, we've got both a sun and a sun, so you can't mix them up. I'll just plant there in a sort of Chekhov manner, and we'll plant it there, and we'll get back to it. What we'll go to first is, a bit later than Ugarit, we'll go to ancient Israel. To the first book of Kings, chapter 18, concerning Elijah. Elijah, well, we know him as a prophet, whatever that meant. We don't know much about Elijah, about his historicity, or lack thereof. What we have is a collection of legends about this man who was some sort of Yahwist superhero, running around coercing people to not worship pagan gods and so on. At least that's what the Bible tells us. We don't really know what truth lies behind this. But chapter 18 of the first book of Kings is a very special text. It concerns a drought. Now we're back to the drought. There's a great drought in the country, and Elijah says that unless I say so, there will be no rain at all. Because Yahweh has commanded it. And if I don't say that it's going to rain, it's not going to rain. And the current king, Ahab, is a bad guy of the Bible. He's really a bad guy. He worships the Baalim. He worships Baal and does all this sort of naughty stuff because he's married to a Phoenician princess called Jezebel, who supposedly made him do all this bad stuff. So, the God of Israel punishes the land by sending this terrible, destroying drought, and there's a great description of the lack of water and the lack of verdure and the lack of food and the lack of absolutely everything. What does Elijah do? What he does is, he makes a little experiment. I would call what he does experimental theology. Practical experimental theology. That's what he does. At least according to the Bible, that's what he does. So he collects all the prophets of Baal, the prophets of the so-called pagan god. And there were a lot of those, over 400 of them. And he collects all of them up on Mount Carmel, which is sort of the bump of the northern part of Israel, what is today Israel.
Carmel?
Yeah, Carmel, exactly. And they go up the mountain, and it's 1 against 400, basically. He's the prophet of Yahweh, and here we have 400 prophets of Baal, and he says to the people, well, just test us. Which God can make the rain and which God can't? And what do you think happens? What would you suspect happened? Well, of course, this is a deeply ideological, theologized text, and of course what happens is that, the Baal priests, they run around and they slash their skins and dance and all the things they usually do. The Deuteronomist author says that they do this kemishpatam, as they usually do. Whatever that means, but, well, kemishpatam, according to their mores or something like that. And they dance around and they scream and they shout for Baal, and of course nothing happens. And Elijah even mocks them and says, whoa, what's happened to your God? Where is Baal? Maybe he's out traveling. Maybe he's asleep. Why doesn't he do anything? And of course nothing happens. And Elijah just makes one sacrifice. He pours some water, makes a sacrifice, and of course there's an absolutely awesome display of thunder and lightning, and then the rain comes and everybody's happy, and all the people say, Adonai hu ha-Elohim. Yahweh is the one God. And the winner is clear, of course, in this sort of experiment in practical theology. And promptly, of course, all the Baal worshippers are put to death in true Old Testament fashion. That is, of course, an exhilarating story, as a story, if nothing else. I mean, I'm not here to tell you whether or not this actually happened. There are various views on this, of course, but it's an exhilarating story. It's an adventure story. But what is this really about? Why does the so-called Deuteronomist author write this story? What is he trying to say? Well, of course he's trying to say that Yahweh is greater than Baal, because that was a major theological point he wanted to make. The God of Israel was the one God, and the other gods were nothing. But why does he take this test case, a drought? And why does the prophet Elijah taunt his opponents in this specific way? He says, maybe your God is away. Maybe he's asleep. What does he mean by that? What's his point? Well, now we have to go further back. The Hebrew Bible is an awesome document. It is an awesome document if only for the reason that it's so very expansive in length. The earliest texts in the Hebrew Bible were possibly written before of the 1000 BC. We don't know exactly, but the Song of Deborah could possibly be from the 1120s, if you're a bit optimistic. Some people would say it's 10th century, but it's early anyway. And the latest texts in the Old Testament are parts of the book of Daniel, which usually puts sometime around 167 of the Common Era, which means that the Hebrew Bible includes about 1,000 years of text. Not many textual collections do that. It's an enormous an enormous spectrum.
This doesn't exactly match the 700 years that God is supposed to have waited for having the idea of creating the universe and implementing it.
Well, no.
It's not included. It's
Well, what can I say? It doesn't really match up. It doesn't really match up. What God said or did not say is not my field of expertise. I am an historian. Well,
You are at least in Department of Religious Studies.
oh yes, indeed. But it is the Department of Scientific Study of Religion, or at least scholarly, whatever that means. but I am not a theologian in the strict sense of the word. Even though I am in the Department of Theology, which is, of course, a situation which could take some discussion at another time. But, as I said, the earliest parts of the Old Testament are possibly a bit before 1000 BC, or BCE, if you so wish. But there are earlier texts from this culture over here. There are the texts from Ugarit, which were discovered in 1928. The city of Ugarit, which I mentioned earlier, was discovered in 1928 by a farmer ploughing his field, and he ran into something. And it was, it was sort of a lid on a tomb, which led to various excavations, which led to the entire city being found. A city called, of course, in those days it was called Ugarit. Today the place is called Ras Shamra. Some of you may have heard of, I don't know. Ras Shamra, it's Arabic, it means fennel cape. Fenkolskullen, it would be in Swedish. And there was the ancient city of Ugarit, and as I said, it's a marvelous city. I've never been there, for which I'm very sorry, but you can't really go to Syria right now. Not as it stands. But the main enormous find were the texts. Texts written in alphabetic cuneiform. And alphabetic cuneiform is something weird. Cuneiform was one of the greatest forms of written communication ever known to man. The first form of written communication known to man, actually. Cuneiform, you know, you've seen it. That means God. In Sumerian and Akkadian, it's Ilu in Akkadian and Dingir in Sumerian. The Sumerians were the ones who invented cuneiform, sometime around 3300 BC, give or take. And it spread all over the ancient Near East, and almost every language was written in it. Of course not Egyptian.
But
Well,
Hittite was.
Hittite was. Oh yes, Hittite was. Hittite was written in it, and so was Akkadian, and so was Sumerian, and lots of other languages.
But I think that is the only Indo-European language.
No, actually there are a couple of others, Luvian, for example, and Palaic, which are not very well known among yes, but as you said, one of the major languages written in cuneiform was Hittite, which is related to Swedish and English and the other European languages.
You mean Swedish and Finnish are related?
Yes. Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. And
My
Sanskrit.
grandmother related.
Yeah, sorry. And Sanskrit and all of the others. But Akkadian, the language of the Babylonians and Assyrians, is not related to the European languages. It is a Semitic language, so that is, it's related to Hebrew, and it's related to Ugaritic. The cuneiform script is cumbersome. I don't know if any of you have tried to learn it. I certainly have, and it does take its time. It's an awful way of writing. It's really torturous. There are, in the nice version of this script, there are somewhere around 600 signs, and most of them are polyvalent, which means that one sign can often be read in 7 or 8 or even 10 different ways. And many of the signs are homophonous and can be read in the same way, so there are a number of different li signs and a number of different an signs and so on and so forth. So it's awful. It's beautiful when you can do it, but it's really awful. It's sort of written the way Japanese is today. The same sort. The script is actually built on the same principle as modern Japanese. Yeah, which is very, very difficult. And the people of Ugarit they noticed this, that this is a difficult, very difficult way of writing, but they also thought it was immensely practical. You know, you write on these small clay tablets, which are immensely durable. You can find them today. They're immensely more durable than paper or papyrus or CD-ROMs or whatever. Clay is the most durable of all, I'd say.
They cared about whether we find it a couple of thousand years
Yes,
afterwards.
they certainly did. And sometimes, sometimes, you know, in the text they even say so. They were very proud of their work. But the Ugaritians, they liked the idea of these little clay tablets, but they thought the cuneiform writing system was awful, which it comes to be fair, it was. So they created a cuneiform alphabet. They took the principle of making these sort of small wedges in clay, but they used it for the alphabet. So it was no longer 600 signs, it was 30 signs.
But alphabet was already probably created for a bit further south, no?
Well,
Minus 13th, 14th century.
yeah, somewhere around that. We don't know exactly when, but it was probably a few hundred years
Well,
earlier.
before.
Yeah, probably, by some sort of Canaanites or other. So they took the alphabet and they made a cuneiform alphabet, which made it very easy for us to read in modern time because there were only 30 signs to crack. And this is what you get when you transcribe it back. And in this alphabet, they wrote something marvelous. They wrote down their Canaanite mythology. In the Hebrew Bible, the Canaanites are the worst. They are the worst of pagans and harlots and evil people and, like, you know, like the worshippers of Baal in the Elijah story, you know. Put them to death, put them to death. They're unclean. But at Ugarit we find them speaking. We have their own myths. And the main myths is about a guy whose name is written like this. I'll write it in cuneiform just to stun you. And this is B. And this is the very strange Semitic letter I. And this is Lamed.
Wow.
Baal. Yeah. The main hero was Baal.
This is an item.
Yes.
Yeah.
And he was a son of God? Or he was
Well,
God
no,
himself?
he was a god.
But from this sentence which you...
Yeah, well, he doesn't appear there. He doesn't appear in the
Ah.
sentence. No. The story about Baal from Ugarit is a fascinating one. He battles various enemies. He battles mainly two. One of them is the sea, Yam, and the other is death, Mort. Those are his two great enemies, sea and death. And he battles them in order to build his great palace on his mountain and rule the gods and rule gods and men.
It's like a Numa Elish, which means it's
Oh
like
yes, oh yes, oh yes.
it's like a chaos and you
Oh,
need to
yeah,
build
oh,
some
yes,
order.
oh,
yeah?
yes, oh, yes, oh. And what happens when he battles death? Death is an awful character. Mort. In Hebrew it's Mavet. In Ugaritic it's Mort. It can be Mort in Hebrew too, actually, in certain inflections. Mort is an awful character. No one worships him. You don't want to worship Mort. His jaws reach from the underworld to the sky. He swallows everything. No one escapes death. And the first thing he does is he says to the young king, Baal, he says, well, pardon the French, but he says, fuck you, so to speak. He says, I'm not going to obey you. I'm stronger than you. You're a schmuck. And Baal says, oh, okay, well, yeah, you got a point. Baal gives up. Baal gives up. And he descends into the gullet of Mort, the divine Mort. He is swallowed by the god of death. Baal dies. Temporarily, but he dies. And when Baal, the great king of the gods, is dead, no one can send the rain. No one can send the irrigation. No one can make the plants grow. Death swallows the entire land. And what happens to the sun? It burns. It scorches. And the heavens are powerless into the hands of death.
The heavens, it means the main gods.
Well, no, the heavens, I think it's...
The whole collective of
well,
gods.
I think it means, I think it is actually very prosaic. It means the heavens, the physical heavens.
Just physical heavens.
Yeah, they can't bring the rain. They're powerless. Because you have to think about that this is a literature created in a climate very different from what we know in Sweden. In Sweden, we grow up thinking, that, oh, mother, son, la 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 la, oh, it's so nice. And rain is awful. Rain is awful. But if you're down in the Levant, if you're a farmer in Bronze Age Syria, things are very different. Rain is life. Sun is death.
Even now.
Even now. Even now.
The story about Abraham and Hagar.
Oh,
who sent
absolutely.
To the death.
Absolutely.
In the desert,
Absolutely.
To the heat.
Absolutely. 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 And this little sentence, which reoccurs 3 times in the Ugaritic text, it's sort of a refrain. In my work, I call it the refrain of the burning sun, which I'm rather proud of, I must say. It recurs telling about the awful state of the universe when Baal is dead, and after various goings on, Baal comes back and sends his rains, and everybody's happy, and he retakes his kingship. He cannot defeat Mort. Death cannot die. But death gives up. And why does he give up? It's really interesting. At the end of this cycle, the one who scares the god of death, who do you think that is? It's the sun. Shapshu, the solar goddess. And there has been a lot of discussion. Why should he be afraid of the solar goddess, who is, after all, a rather minor character? And I believe that the reason that Mort, death, is so afraid of the sun.
The sun
Yes.
dies and appears.
Yes. Two reasons. The sun is intimately connected to the land of the dead for 2 reasons. One, just as you say, she appears to fall down below the horizon into the land of the dead each and every day or night. And it is through the medium of the sun that the evil god has sent his power. The sun has been the channel of his power over the land. The sun is the one through which he has been burning the land and destroying the verdure and so on and so forth. Which means that if not even the sun is on his side, no one is. So when Shapshu says, "Do not fight with Baal," then he gives up. Let's go back to Elijah. Back to the 9th century in Israel on Mount Carmel, where we started. Because you must understand that these 2 cultures are extremely close. Ancient Israel is special because it gradually created what we today know as monotheism. Ancient Israel was not originally monotheist. It had a few gods, of which Yahweh was the highest, and then gradually, for various historical reasons, the other gods got ousted and only Yahweh was left. But ancient Israel was very special because this happened. It didn't really happen anywhere else, not in that consistent manner anyway. But the 2 cultures, the Ugaritic one and the Israelite one, were very close. They were linguistically close. The 2 languages are both Northwest Semitic. You can make a beautiful phylogenetic tree of the Northwest Semitic languages, and that means Northwest Semitic, which basically has 3 linguistic branches, one of which is Canaanite, one of which is Aramaic, and one of which is Ugaritic. And Canaanite, there you find languages like Phoenician and Moabite, which is basically only preserved in one inscription, the great Stele of Mesha. And we find Hebrew. So you see that Hebrew and Ugaritic are actually rather close to each other.
Like a nephew.
Yeah, you could say that Ugaritic is the evil uncle of Hebrew, something like that. Which means that they're close to each other linguistically, they're close to each other poetically.
Could they understand each other? Could you give some kind of...
No, I don't think they would have. I don't think they would have, because...
But there are mutual roots of words.
Yeah, oh yes, oh yes.
Shemesh.
Yeah, oh
Yahweh.
yes, all the
same
time.
root.
All the time, all the same root.
Of course.
But Ugaritic was much more archaic. I like to say that the relationship between classical Hebrew and Ugaritic is about the same as modern Swedish is to Icelandic. It's something like that.
Well, that's how I managed to read Icelandic, with a new modern Swedish.
Well, yeah. Well, but it wasn't that easy, was it?
I had to struggle somewhat.
Yeah, you did.
Not too bad.
But these two cultures they're not only close to each other linguistically, they are close to each other poetically and religiously, in a religious sense. And we can see this because there are a number of places in the Hebrew Bible which contain almost, in some cases, exactly verbatim quotes. Well, it's not actually quotes, but it looks like quotes.
Allusions?
Well, yeah. Quote would imply that they actually sat with the Ugaritic text in front of them. Of course they didn't. But they shared a poetic inheritance. You can find it in Isaiah chapter 27, verse 1. ביום ההוא יפקוד אדוני בחרבו הקשה והגדולה את לוויתן, something like it. It's, you know, God is going to strike the Leviathan, the great dragon. And the Leviathan is described as Nahash Akalaton, the writhing serpent. This word Akalaton, writhing, wriggling, that's a hapax legomenon. Do you know what a hapax legomenon is? Yeah, right. It's a Greek term. It means a word which is only read once. A word which is only attested once. Which of course means that it's very hard to translate it. And imagine the surprise when the Ugaritic texts were first found, and they found this exact word being used about the Leviathan. Otanu akalatanu. It sounds Ugaritic, but actually it's the same word. Not only that word, but the whole phrase is almost identical, which means that there was a shared poetic world. It wasn't a matter of the one culture quoting the other, it was a matter of both of them sharing the same Northwest Semitic cultural sphere, in which these terms sort of must have lived in the minds of bards and whatnot. So they're very close to each other, these two cultures. And if we look at this text about Elijah from that perspective, what we know about the Baal worshipping Canaanites of Ugarit, what do we find? Why is the great test case a drought? Why? Well, of course, because what the Baal worshippers were saying was that their god, Baal, could defeat drought. That's what they themselves were saying. By ultimately defeating Mort, the god of death. That was their great claim. Our God can defeat death and bring rain to the land. Well, of course, then the Yahwist author of 1 Kings 18, he wants to beat Baal at his own game. That's what he wants to do. So that's why the test case is a drought. And then we look at what do the Baal prophets do in the story. They dance around. Many religious people have historically been known to dance around. That's not very specific. But what they do they cut themselves. They lacerate themselves with spears. So they bleed. Think of the, the Ashura festivities in modern Iraq. Yeah. That gives an idea of what it must have looked like. I think, well, lots of blood. Why do they do this? Again, let's go to the sources. Let's go to the Ugaritic Baal cycle. As I said, Baal dies. What happens when he dies? His friends mourn him. His friends, his wife and sister, sort of the same thing, Anat, and his and one of the other great gods, El, they mourn him. And how do they mourn him? They slash themselves. They gash their skin with flint. And what do the Baal prophets do in Elijah? They do exactly that. They mourn the death, the absence of Baal, which is, of course, quite natural, because there's a drought. And then what does Elijah say? Let's go back. What did Elijah say? He taunted them. With what did he taunt them? He said, maybe your God is asleep. Maybe he's traveling. Well, of course, this is a taunt against this idea that Baal can be dead. He's asleep. Well, he wasn't. Not that much, at least. Yeah. So he's actually attacking the Baal worshippers for the very thing that they must have regarded as in some sense, the center of their own religion. And without actually reading these Canaanite texts, which has only been possible during the 20th century, since they were discovered in 1928, this text was very strange. It must have been very, very strange to read this in the Middle Ages. Which, of course, they did. They, they wrote books and books of commentary to it. But to understand historically, what is it that the author attacks? Must have been very hard. Must have been very, very hard. Yes. Let's see. Back to you, Grit. The sun. The burning sun. As you so well pointed out, the sun is a sort of liminal character at Ugarit. The sun is not quite a bad guy at Ugarit, a bad girl, rather. But not quite a good girl either. She stands at the crossroads. And why is that? Well, just as you said, she falls down into the netherworld every night. A great cycle, which was their, of course, their way of viewing it. And she is both nice, she gives light and warmth, but she also gives terrible heat. Terrible, terrible heat. And both these things, her nightly journey beneath the horizon and her drought-inducing heat, connected her with the god of death and his rule, which of course made her a sort of ambivalent character. Not evil in any sense, but ambivalent. And these lines, this refrain, is, I think, a way of processing that ideologically. What is happening here? Why is the sometimes nice sun not so nice? Well, because she is ruled by death. She's ruled by death. She's ruled by the god of death. In my work personally, in my dissertation, I'm actually not done with it yet. I hopefully will be during the spring. What I'm looking at is how did the Israelites, how did they take this idea of the burning, so to speak, evil sun and transform it? What did they do with this when it was no longer possible to point the finger at a god of death? I mean, for a classical Israelite theologian, it was not that easy to say, oh, the god of death is coming along. You can find him in a couple of places in the Old Testament, but normally it's not really acceptable to talk about a specific god of death in the Old Testament. So they changed this. They took this ancient phenomenon, the burning sun, the terrible drought, and they processed it theologically. How are we going to use this in our cultural milieu? And they did that in a number of different ways. In some of the earlier texts in the Old Testament, it actually still does appear that the drought, the burning sun, is something outside the Israelite God. We can find that in Hosea chapter 13. I'll just look it up. Hosea is a fantastic text. It is so weird. Someday you should just sit down reading the book of Hosea. It's completely bizarre in a lovely way. And it's even better in Hebrew because it's written in dialect, which makes it strange. Yeah. Here it is. Yeah. He says, Yahweh says something like, "Where is your sting, O death? where is your power? Something like that. And then he describes how the sinful shall be dried out, and their springs shall dry up, and everything. Yeah? And a hot wind shall scorch them. And here we can find something interesting. The drought seems to come from two perspectives. One, death is actually invoked. Yahweh says, where is your sting, O death? He talks to death as though death were an autonomous being. I mean, it's the word. It's the same word, mawet, mort. So there apparently he does sort of exist by himself. But on the other hand, the drought also comes from the east wind, which is normally connected to Yahweh himself. You know, it's the wind coming down, both from the east and from the south, down from Sinai and Horeb and so on. So here it appears in Hosea chapter 13 that the drought is sort of collaborative. You know, Yahweh does his part and Mawet does his part, and the sinner is dried up. So that's sort of an intermediate stage where it appears that death is an autonomous character, but he's still sort of he works at the behest of the Israelite God. Later on, this is completely transformed. If you look at a rather late text of the Old Testament, the book of Malachi, which is one of the later prophetical writings, we have a wonderful text in chapter 3. In the Swedish Bible it's chapter 4, in the Hebrew Bible it's chapter 3, but it's the same text, which talk about the day of Yahweh, the great eschatological day of Yahweh, when the sun of righteousness shall rise with healing upon its wings. That is for the good guys. But the bad guys will be burned and so on and so forth. And what has the Israelite author done here? He has taken these two ambivalent views of the sun. The nice sun which heals and warms and has beautiful wings in the iconography and everything. And he applies that to Yahweh when he's being nice. But the burning, terrible, drought-giving, scorching sun which we find here, they solve that by, well, they say that's Yahweh too, when he's angry. And this is actually very creative. The author appears, or authors possibly, appear to have taken an ancient Canaanite concept, which might possibly have seemed rather theologically repugnant to them at that time, because this is a late text. And they transform it, using their own ideological presuppositions about how it ought to be. But it's still there. They do not expunge it, they change it. And that's basically what I've been working with. And of course, verbs. I love verbs. Well, as I said, there's been a lot of discussion what this one really means. The scorch verb, the burn verb, which is related to a number of words for colour, like tzahor, which in antiquity appears to have meant something like white or greyish or sandy. Today it means normally white, does it?
Yeah. White, yeah. Shining white.
Okay,
yes.
Shining white is today. Well, in antiquity it appears to have been a bit more unclear. The root appears in Arabic too, and if you look that up in the Arabic lexicon, you find red, white, a colour with a little redness and whiteness, etc., 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 etc. All colours you can think of. Even black, I think. But what connects all these is the root meaning to burn. If you look at modern South Arabian, not Arabic, but modern South Arabian, the languages like Sopotri and Mehri, which are minority languages.
They are correct?
No, they're not Arabic. They're Arabian, which means they're spoken in Arabia, but they're not what we call Arabic.
Where are they spoken?
Semitic?
Oh yes, they're Semitic, but quite different.
Where are they spoken?
They're spoken in, Hadramaut, for example, and the Socotra island. They're very endangered today, because Arabic has pushed them away. There you actually find, to this day, this verb, sahara, meaning to burn or to cauterize.
The Sahara Desert has no relation to it?
Yes, it does. Yes, it does. The Great Desert, the Sahara, is actually from this very root, which is a bit fun, isn't it? If you, when you think about the theological implications of that, the burned land, and you can even go further back if you want to become really speculative. The Semitic languages are part of a greater phylum called Afro-Asiatic, which has 6 known branches, which I won't bother you with, but one of them is Egyptian, ancient Egyptian. You know, the hieroglyph stuff. In ancient Egyptian, the word for desert is, this is actually a bit fun in many ways, the word is dishert. It has absolutely nothing to do with the word desert. That's a complete coincidence. Yeah. But it can be shown through consistent philological, phonological analysis with sound laws and so on, that the d is from th, that the sh is from he, and well, there you have it. The burned land.
And that goes back, the common root would go back how far?
Well, if the root, if the root indeed is Proto-Asiatic, I think we're looking at something like 7,000 or 8,000 years, which is rather a lot. Rather a lot.
From now?
From now, yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
from now.
Or what? Maybe some people will put it even further back.
Yes.
Some people will. Some people would perhaps put it 10,000 from now. The problem is we don't know exactly when the Afro-Asiatic Ursprache was spoken. That's extremely unclear. But you know, it apparently is a Proto-Asiatic root, which means that this imagery of the burned land is very, very old. And it appears again and again, and it gets transformed back and forth.
And how much was this used, this ancient Egyptian word?
Well, it was the normal Egyptian word for desert.
Yeah, but is there a lot of evidence?
Oh yes, oh yes, oh yes. It's well attested, and it goes on even into Coptic, the latest version of Egyptian, where it is attested in the form Orshe, which means desert. So it's a completely common word, actually. But this imagery comes back and it comes back and it's transformed, but it still comes back, and you can even find it, funnily enough, in modern Swedish hymns. You know, the Swedes among you have probably been exposed to this actually rather lovely Allt kötter hö och blomstren dö och tiden allt fördriver. Very famous hymn in Sweden, which takes its the basic gist and its text from Isaiah chapter 40, which talks of, you know, everything except the word of God being like the burned grass. All meat is hay. This doesn't make very much sense up here, does it? And this shows the strength of what I like to call poetic inheritance. It was created in a place where the climate was drought-ridden, where this imagery was created in a part of the world where drought was an acute problem, and is still an acute problem. It was created by using specific words, specific verbal roots. There are a lot of others, I've just shown you one, which had persisted for a very long time. It came into the book of Isaiah, sometime in the 500s BC, where he used this ancient poetic heritage as a way of describing the power of what he saw as the word of God. Everything, you know, the people was burned. And it ends up in a Swedish hymn book 2,500 years later. That's poetic inheritance. Yeah.
5 minutes.
Yeah, okay, thank you. So basically the point of this sort of rambling soiree is not that climate decides everything. because it's clear that it doesn't. Even today in Swedish churches, people sing this hymn, which actually makes no real sense here. You know, of course, hay does get dried here too, but it's not that acute a problem. It isn't.
It's good when it does, huh?
Yeah, almost. Yeah.
Before winter.
But the poetic formulae survive. And they survive not for tens of years, not for hundreds of years, they survive for thousands of years. Sometimes because of actual quotation, which is the case with the hymn, they've quoted 2nd Isaiah, chapter 40. And sometimes just in terms of shared poetic linguistic memory, which is of course what happened with the Leviathan and his wriggling, his writhing. I mean, I really do not believe, I don't think any biblicist believes that the Old Testament author sat with a Ugaritic cuneiform tablet and quoted it, or rather that way. That's not what happened. But they shared a poetic universe. Like probably the medieval bards did in Europe. They had a store, a vast store of poetic imagery which they could use for their own purposes. And parts of that was the burning sun and the drought. And they used it for very different reasons. At Ugarit, they used it to describe an autonomous god of death ruling the world. 1,000 years later, in ancient Israel, Malachi uses it to describe the supreme power of the Israelite God, who is both the destroying sun who burns his enemies into stubble, and the Son of Righteousness, the Shemesh Tzedakah, who rises with healing on his wings. Thank you.
Yes, we have time for some questions before, Grisha, you are dressed for many questions.
I saw that maybe somebody.
Okay, somebody in the back? No? Okay. Yeah?
So, what was the approximate period of existence of this Ugarit from each time to?
Yeah, it's actually, I believe that the earliest settlements are actually from the 6000s BC. But what we know anything about is
This culture, which actually kind of.
Yeah. It's say 1600 to 1180, something BC, something like that.
After 1180?
It's destroyed. The entire city is destroyed. In sometime around 1200, 1180, the city is destroyed.
So when actually the Israelis could interact with them? On their way south or on their way north?
Excuse me?
How Israelis interacted with them? I mean, there was not exact proximity. There was
Oh, you mean the
kind of further north.
yeah, well, but you know the
On their way
entire.
from Mesopotamia.
Well, the entire. Are you speaking now of trade routes, or are you speaking of
The physical interaction.
physical interaction? Well, I don't know if there was much. Well, at some point there was physical interaction because there are lots of letters from at Ugarit which are attested. Which talk of relations with Canaan and so on. So
There's
we
a
know
lot
that
of travel.
they travelled. that's quite clear.
commerce.
But also they were linguistically and culturally very, very close. They sprung from the same source, so to speak. Sprung in very, very different directions, but from the same source. And it's not that far. It looks far to us, but it's not that far. I mean, the Germanic linguistic group. I mean, the Vandals were down in North Africa, but they were still Germanic. So, yeah.
Can you give a good reference for the sources of the Ugarit where one can read these texts?
Yeah, sure.
Good book with texts.
Yeah, sure.
Text with
English or
Hebrew, Ugaritic, whatever.
Yeah, I can give you a number.
Not Swedish, so.
Not
Well,
Swedish.
I actually translated them into Swedish a few years ago, but that would help.
That would be very helpful.
But there's a great book. I think the best translation into English is called Ugaritic Narrative Poetry. And that has the added benefit of including the Ugaritic texts side by side. So if you want to try a hand of the Ugaritic, you can do that.
And translate it into English.
You have the Ugaritic here and you have the English here.
Who is the
on facing
author?
pages. Well, it's edited by a man called Simon B. Parker, if I remember correctly. But there are a number of different people who have been doing the various myths, various specialists.
According to the Bible,
Yeah.
the birth of the monotheism or God, Jehovah, if you
Yeah.
want, didn't begin in Israel. It began with Abraham when he was somewhere in Iraq, not in Israel. You mentioned this.
But that is probably a very late conception, you know. That is a late theologized idea of what happened. If we look at it religion historically, we don't find monotheism, pure monotheism, in Israel, in Israelite thinking before the 500s BC. And
Well, 700.
Oh, that depends. No.
But we always try to push.
No, 700 Yoshiao is obvious.
Yeah,
They found
Josiah
the
possibly.
I think this is a discussion for the next part.
Just for wine and cheese party.
500 or 700, you know, I will not tell you what
It's a
Sweden was
huge
like,
difference.
but it was like
It's a huge difference. In 500 they weren't there. They were in
Oh
Babylon.
yes, they were in Babylonia.
In Babylon.
Yeah, the King Josiah apparently wanted people to worship only Yahweh.
Exactly.
But the problem is, did that mean that he didn't believe the other gods existed? That's two different things. That's two different things.
Anyway, the Egyptian king Meshach didn't give him a lot of chance to express himself. He just cut his head.
Ah, well.
Wonderful, thank you.
Are we going to, well, one question, last question for Mani.
By what or whom were the Yugarit destroyed? You know?
Well, it's not clear. There are a number of theories. Many of the two main theories is that either there came the so-called sea peoples, which was a conglomerate of various marauding characters who appeared to have sort of crushed a lot of the Well, no, it could have been them.
That's late?
Yeah.
I mean, the Horkanai quarreled with this,
but
And the
a
Hittites
couple of
too.
centuries before.
Yeah, well, but you know, they
Around
kept going.
1200.
Some people will say they kept, yeah. And the other alternative is actually drought. Believe it or not. Possibly, I actually think it's quite probable it was both. But it would be away it went. Yeah.
Okay, so we're going to have...
Excellent.
Yeah,